Hey everybody, it's Ryan and Rocket. Welcome back to How Farms Work. So about a week ago I received a message from one of our viewers who had asked me to make a video featuring my common sense farm safety tips. And I think that's generally a good idea because what may be common sense to us may not be common sense to everyone else who is new to the farm scene. And I think that it's generally a good idea for people just to share general farm safety tips. So down in the comments section, if you guys could, if I've missed anything, which there are numerous, countless safety tips to keep in mind when on the farm, but these are just the ones that I've thought of off of the top of my head. So with that, I'm going to walk you guys around the farm, just kind of point out some things that I always keep on mind whenever I'm here, just to keep myself safe as well as everybody else around me. And like I said, feel free to drop any other tips down in the comments below, or feel free to look if you guys are looking for more farm safety tips. With that, I figured that it's probably a good idea to start with the skid loader, because skid loaders are one of the most dangerous pieces of equipment on farms, right next to tractors. But I'll go to them shortly. The biggest thing to keep in mind whenever you're around a skid loader or using one is to never climb under the boom, whether it be to walk under it or to climb out of the machine. A story I have about climbing out of one of these things, and it's happened around this area, is a farmer was climbing out of his skid loader and his pant legs caught the controls. So as he was getting out, the loader came down on top of him and it killed him. So it's one of those things to always keep in mind. Manufacturers always try to put things in place to keep stuff like that from happening, but you can never really be too safe. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is to never ride on the front of one of these machines, because as you're driving along, something terrible may happen. You may get thrown from the machine. If you're using it to raise yourself up, the machine may fall forward. Not saying that it'll happen in most cases, but they are literally a 1 in 100,000 case. So with that, those are my two big things about skid loaders. If you're operating one, always make sure that you're aware of your surroundings, and if you're around one of these machines when someone else is operating them, always maintain a pretty reasonable safe amount of distance from the machines so that you can evacuate the area if they start to move towards you by not seeing you. Always make sure that you wear your seatbelt whenever you're in one of these machines, and always try to carry the load as low as possible. The reason being is because if you're carrying a load at a high elevation, what can happen is that if the machine becomes front heavy, the machine can come slamming forward to the ground, and if you're sitting in the seat, you're either in for one heck of a roller coaster ride, or you're going to be thrown through the windshield if it has one. And the best thing there is to always make sure that you're wearing your seatbelt. That is one of the biggest reasons that these machines come with seatbelts right next to, in case if they roll over. I have a bit of a story about riding on the front of one of these machines, and it actually comes from this farm. My grandma, after she had passed, or by the time her passing came around, she did not have all the fingers on her hands. The reason being is because, like in one circumstance, I can't remember all of the exact details, but what I believe happened was they were moving a calf from the barn over to the hutches, which were by the road. And they would use a leash around the calf's neck to pull him out of the barn and put him into the skid loader bucket. As such, my grandma would ride over with the calf over to the hutches. And what happened in one situation, I believe it was with a leash, was the rope had slipped off of the bucket underneath the skid loader, and she had it wrapped around her fingers. The rope, I believe, had gone under the tire, and it crushed her fingers. And as such, she did not have all of her fingers. I believe she had situations like that maybe once or twice over her lifetime, and it's one of those things that you just don't really think about. And that's one of the reasons why you should never really ride in the front of one of these machines. I know that we do violate our own rules on the farms from time to time, but those are the kinds of things that we always make sure that we're aware of. We know the risk that we're taking, and not saying that it's a good thing to take those risks. I advise each and every one of you not to. So with that is essentially all of my quick tips around skid loaders to stay safe. Next we're going to be moving on to tractors. Now I'm standing in front of a good old 4020. I decided that I would do a walk around on the 4020 and all of the safety tips that I have for you, because these machines shipped without many of the common safety features that you see today, such as seat belts. One of the most dangerous things about tractors like these were the models without the year-round cab on it. A lot of 4020s shipped with an open station without any rollover protection systems, which is essentially just a giant bar on the back of the machine in case you roll over that it doesn't crush you. Now, if you were riding passenger on one of these open station 4020s, you would often find yourself riding right on the fender here. And what you started to notice is that when you got up to speed, like going down the road, is that these wheels were awfully close. Something that still happens, unfortunately, very, very commonly on farms are people getting run over by tractors. And one of the things is younger children falling off the machine and falling in front of the wheel. And that is why I advise all of you to never ride passenger on an open station tractor if you can avoid it. Otherwise, that's just something to keep in mind. Always hold on to the machine as tightly as you can. If you end up doing so, just keep in mind that that is a major killer when it comes to tractors. Another major killer are when these machines are hooked up to something. And I want to make this point very clear, is that even if you have, most commonly like a child, but also dogs riding with you, if you have something hooked up to the machine and it has hydraulics hooked up, what you'll find yourself doing if something breaks is getting out of the machine with it still running to see what's going wrong, what's making that noise, whatever it is. And something that can happen is if you get out of the machine and you go to look, you might stick your hand up underneath somewhere, and this can happen with dogs too. They might hit something. Children, I mean, they like to play with levers. And my advice in that situation would be to make sure that the machine is always turned off whenever you exit. For that reason being the most, even with dogs, we're always extremely careful. I mean, even with Rocket in the cab, if I have to get out and look at something and I have to stick my hand in somewhere that, you know, is pretty dangerous or has a high risk of injuring me, I'll make sure to shut the machine off, because I'll never know what Rocket's going to do. He might jump up on the console, which I don't really expect him to, but it's just something to always keep on your mind. And that's another caveat with tractors is the hydraulics. Another being the PTO. PTOs are major killers with tractors. So here in the 4020, you can see does not have the PTO guard on it, which I'm not totally sure why it doesn't, but that might be something for me to look into, try to go find it. So another thing, stay away from the PTOs on tractors. I'm going to come back to this shortly as far as the hookups for like the blower over there. I'll go look at it and show you guys what to actively avoid. If you ever find yourself operating one of these machines that doesn't have a rollover protection system on it, be very careful to make sure that you do not go into any kind of hillsides, any situation where the machine feels unsteady, I guess you could say. The reason being is because machines like this have killed people even in our area over the years. So that is another big thing to keep in mind about tractors. Sometimes, and I will admit, I've had this happen, and I have ever since been extremely careful not to start the machine like this, is I've started the machine by not being in the seat. You never want to do that, because you never know if it is in neutral, and you can't see that, at least very clearly, most of the time from standing outside of the machine. So obviously right now it looks like it's in park, but you know, you might just glance at it and it might be in first. When you go to start the machine, what has happened to some people over the years who were unfortunate to do it was that they would start the machine and it would lunge forward. Now, on some machines where the parking brakes are not set in with the gears, because in like a 4020, you shift it into park. Whereas in like a semi, you shift it into a neutral, and then the parking brake is separate. But on a machine like this, they do have some, I should say, not all of them, do have protection systems in place to keep you from starting the machine. If it's not neutral, they won't start. I believe the 4020. I'm actually going to try this right now. And I just want to test it to see. So I'm going to go ahead and try to start this while it's in first. Absolutely nothing. I turn the key, nothing happens. Now, not all machines have that. And that's a point that I want to make very clear. This is what kills people, is because they're around machines that do things like this, and then they come across a machine like Big Red way over there, where they don't have that happen. Luckily with Big Red, I was fortunate enough to have it be in park. So I was on the machine itself, but it's just overall something, and I'm telling you, I'm learning from my mistakes, that you should never try to start the machine without being in the seat. If you do, you are taking a risk. Again, that's a risk that we do commonly too often take, and ever since the whole Big Red incident, which was one of the first times I had been around it, I knew machines did that, but I was absolutely sure that I put it into neutral. What I think happened, actually, is that we had the dogs up in the truck, and I think they actually bumped it, or maybe one of us was working in the back, and we bumped it when we were getting out. But I know when I put it there that it was in neutral. And it tried to lunge forward, but the machine did not have enough, really enough jump to it to jump into gear. Or didn't have enough torque or power to go into gear, I should say. So another thing to keep in mind whenever you're around tractors. My very last tip for you, whenever you're around tractors, actually operating them, is to be careful on the roads. People out there are crazy drivers. I've had it all too often when I'm going to pull left into a farm, even with my blinkers on, and people blow past me on the left side. So I always make sure to look if I can. Generally what I'll do is, if I'm turning left, don't forget your hand signals. Stick your left arm, if you're trying to make a left turn, out the left window, or if you can, out the left window. Make this gesture. This means left. And if you're trying to make a right turn, this means right. So oftentimes, if you see someone stick their arm out like this, it means they're trying to make a left turn. If their blinkers aren't working, or they just don't have blinkers overall, or turn signals, I should say. So another thing to try to keep you safe, make sure you try to signal to make sure that people around you know what you're trying to do. Even then, just always be extremely careful. And what I've done in the past is, if I can't see behind me, I'll stick my arm out the left window, especially the 4020 and say the feed mill, and I'll gradually start working my way over towards the yellow line. So it kind of deters anyone from trying to pass me if there's traffic oncoming, and they'll tend to slow down. So that was my last tip as far as tractors go, and we're going to move on to the blower, because it has something on it that I want to show you guys, which we need to get fixed. This is a blower. We use it to blow our corn up into the corn silo. These units are particularly dangerous because they have large fans inside them that sling the material or blow it up into the silo itself. Now, there's a couple things on this particular unit that you want to be careful of whenever you're around it, any kind of blower really. And that is, it's pretty easy to be walking along and trip on something and fall right into it. Now, this is an emergency shutoff. So let's say you do happen to fall into it. I believe if you were down in here and you pulled on this, that should shut it off. Pretty sure. It's not running right now, so I'm not totally sure which direction is off, but I'm pretty sure forward is engaged. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing is that you really just want to maintain your distance around any kind of machinery that's running, because if you happen to fall into this for whatever circumstance, or you're working on something, you always want to make sure that the blower is off, because you could stick your hand right into there, and if you do, while the machine's operating, I mean, you're going to have a pretty big clue that the machine is running, because it's going to be louder than heck, and you'll be able to see it moving. But that's really not all that out of reach, especially for children. So if you're ever around one of these things, just try to keep your kids away from them. If you are younger, just maintain your distance. So now we're standing at the front half of the blower, and this unit in particular has something wrong with it that I want to highlight. And if you have a unit that looks like this, I advise you to stay away from it as much as possible whenever it is running, because PTOs are a huge killer on farms. Looking at this, you may not notice that anything's wrong with it until I lower the camera, and you'll notice that the front half of the PTO guard is not on. So that is definitely something that we need to fix as soon as possible. We haven't fixed it because we really don't use the blower all that much. Not making excuses, we still need to get on that and fix it as soon as possible. So I'll come back to PTOs in a little bit. I'll take you up and show you a PTO guard that is functioning properly. We're standing up in front of the Easy Trail grain cart now, and as you can see, the PTO shaft guard is fully intact. This one does not have a chain on it. I'll go back and show you the chain on the Brent. So as you can see there is a chain that is wrapped around the shaft guard on the Brent grain cart. The reason for that being is because by chaining up the shaft guard, there really is no rotation going on in the back of the machine, which is, I think, preferable in some situations, but in other situations it's not. I believe it's in the EU where it's a requirement, or it is the law, to have them chained up. The Easy Trail is not chained up, and I would actually prefer it be, especially like on the grain cart, because there are some situations where we will climb up as it's running just to be sure that it is fully cleaned out. Whether it be one of us running the tractor and then the other will check up just to make sure, we'll put it away, whatever. So there are some situations where, like on the Brent, I prefer to have it chained up so that there is no rotation. But if you are running a machine with a shaft guard or with a PTO hooked up to it, my advice to you is at the start of every day, walk back here and just put your hand, without it running, without the machine even on, put your hand on the shaft guard and make sure that the shaft guard spins independently of the shaft. So as you can see there, the shaft guard is working like it should be. Now, when you don't have them chained up, they actually will last longer, which is the reason why in some situations I prefer not to use them. Like on the Ryan 4155, I think that by not having them chained up, there's less of a likelihood that over time something will go wrong in there. The plastic will wear away and they'll fail, which is a commonplace on many farms. One of the biggest killers involving PTOs on American farms are farmers that do not have the shaft guard on because it failed. And the biggest reason that they do fail is because over time, as they run with the chains, they do eventually need to be replaced. However, by not having them chained up, they will last longer. Another situation where I would prefer not to have them chained up, actually an example, would be like on the 4155, because let's say you're out mowing and all of a sudden you hear a bang and you think that you had hit the PTO shutoff, but you didn't. So you get out as the machine, with the machine still running, for instance, because let's admit it, we all do it at one point, and we walk back to the machine just to try to assess where something has gone wrong. And on the 4155, if they were chained up, you would not know that the machine was even on because it runs so quietly, especially at idle. There's really no visual indicator that it would be running other than looking directly at the PTO joints, which is kind of hard to see through if everything is on your machine. So in situations like that, where you're not going to be around the PTO guards, I would think it's better to leave them off, because it's better to have a PTO shaft guard on there that always spins with the shaft, and then it works the one time that you need it to, compared to having it fail over X amount of time and having to replace it. Because let's be honest here, like I said, most farmers where they have something like that happen, where they injure themselves with PTOs, it's in situations where it's missing the PTO shaft guards. Depending on where you are in the world, this may be a silo, that may be a silo, or those may be silos. So we're going to cover the grain bins last. After this, we'll talk about the cement silo, But first, we're going to briefly discuss the harvesters. The biggest thing to keep in mind about harvesters is that, in general, they should not have oxygen on the inside. The reason being is because they use anaerobic conditions to store the feed inside them for longer periods of time to keep it fresher. At least that was the theory. So in certain circumstances, you may find it necessary to climb inside them, such as the corn silo, like the issues that we're having with it right now. The biggest thing that we try to do is make sure that there's always presence of oxygen on the inside whenever we're climbing into them. And we do that by turning on the blower for at least 1 hour before climbing in. And we never climb into the harvester alone. And neither should you. Always make sure that there's at least one person there to make sure that you're doing fine on the inside. Because what actually will happen if there isn't enough oxygen on the inside is you'll just kind of slowly fall asleep without even realizing what's happening, and you won't be thinking very clearly. So my advice would be to always wear a harness if you're going to climb on the inside of a silo, and make sure that you check the atmosphere to make sure that there's a good enough atmosphere to climb into, because like I said, oxygen really shouldn't be in harvesters themselves. And of course, always be careful when climbing them. Just being up high in general is dangerous in and of itself. Here is the cement silo. The biggest thing to keep in mind with this thing is that it can be just as dangerous as the harvesters. There can be a lack of oxygen in these as well, up on top if they are tightly sealed. Ours is not really tightly sealed on the top. We've never really had much of an issue with that. The biggest thing we've had with these cement silos are issues with climbing up on the inside of the chute. So what these silos rely on is a chute, which is on the far side there, and there's a giant blower. There's an unloader actually up the top of these things, and as you use the feed inside, you'll crank it down lower and lower, and it'll pick up the feed, it'll blow it out into the chute, and it'll drop it down onto the feed bunk. So what you have to do every now and then is change the doors on the inside of the silo. As you climb up on the inside of the chute, like let's say you climb up to the top to make sure all the doors are shut, you actually use the doors to climb up on. They have handles on them. And as you climb up, you may face the danger of one of the doors falling inward. Dad's personal experience is climbing up, I believe it's this one, and he was climbing up to the top, and he was trying to make sure that all the doors were shut, whatever. He had to climb, I think you have to take the electric cord back up, and he was climbing up it. One of the doors actually broke inward into the silo. I don't even know if it broke. It wasn't lashed properly, and he actually fell into the silo and was hanging inside, and he had to pull himself back out. So these things can be extremely dangerous. We never really like to use them for that reason. A lot of people have been killed in silos like this. And to climb into after you're finished filling it, you actually have to jump into the silo. Like, it's super sketchy on the top. There's really no railings up there whatsoever. Again, we never really liked it. And in that case, safety harnesses all the way. So now we're standing in front of the grain bins. When you think of grain bin, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it corn? Soybeans? To me, it's suffocation, because suffocation is a major killer with these things. Something that you should never do is climb into a grain bin that has had grain unloaded from it since it had been filled without any kind of safety equipment. Because what happens is, like, let's say you have corn that is particularly high in moisture and it started to rot or crust inside the bin. So one of the warning indicators is if you climb into a bin with corn in it, for example, and you drop into it, is it hard? If so, that may be signs that the corn had been rotting, and if there has been any amount of grain removed from that bin, that is a warning sign that there may be a crust underneath it and you're in danger. So there may be some circumstances where it is necessary to climb into these when you're unloading them, such as, let's say it had been rotting and there's a giant clump of corn that fell down into the center. Well, you have to climb in there with a rod and try to beat that clump out to try to make the grain start flowing again. Or, like in the situation over here, Looking at this notice on the side of the bin, it says out of condition grain can lead to destructive clumps of grain, which may be of sufficient size to damage equipment. Now, in a situation like this, you have to climb in there to work on the bin itself, and the door may not be readily accessible, so you'll have to enter from the top. Here, you're at risk of collapse, but in some situations, you may just have to climb in and use a rod to shove it down and try to break up those clumps to free the sweep if it's not actually damaged. And in situations like that, it can be particularly dangerous. That is my biggest thing that I wanted to discuss about grain bins. That is the biggest killer. Another thing that you always want to watch out for is to make sure that all of your safety guards are in place, like on the unloading auger here. So in here, there's a belt and pulley. I know that in some situations, if for whatever reason you're working on it, you take that shield off and you need to turn it over slowly. I know it can be tempting to put your hands on the pulley and try to turn it by hand. Something that you should always make sure of is to just try not to get your fingers pinched, because fingers have been lost by many people over the years doing things like that. The last point that I want to drive home with grain bins are that you make sure to lock things out if you guys are working on stuff. Not only if someone is in there working on something, but let's say you have something torn apart inside the bin and the sweep is in there. You don't want someone to come up and hit the sweep not knowing, like let's say it's a multi-employee operation, not knowing that something is wrong, and you, like let's say another person comes up and flips the switch and it completely destroys whatever is inside the bin. That's just kind of OSHA 101 right there. But for some of the smaller operations out there, which there are literally hundreds of thousands of them, that's just another thing to keep in mind. So with that, that is pretty much all of the quick safety tips. This video really probably hasn't been all that quick, but those are the things that really just come off the top of my mind right away. I found that you can be safe just by having situational awareness, and just making sure that everybody's accounted for whenever you're running any kind of piece of machinery. Everybody's out of the way, everybody's safe. And that applies to doing things like this. If we're working on something and they want to, like let's say we're unleashing the sweep, and Travis and Dad are, one of them standing over at the door looking at it, and they tell me to turn it on, I'll ask them, are you clear? And they'll say yes. And then that's when I'll actually switch it. I won't just, flip the switch just to make sure that it's running. Just situational awareness, stuff like that is the key to being safe on farms. Really just try to be aware and just do things slowly. Don't rush. There are hundreds, thousands of ways to injure yourself on a farm, and I want all of you guys to be safe out there. So with that, like I said, if you guys have any other tips for this video, be sure to leave them down in the comment section. I know I haven't gotten everything, but I could sit here and talk all day about all of the things to keep in mind whenever on farms. And there's all sorts of different equipment out there, especially like grain bins. Grain bins are exclusive to certain types of farms. Not all of them have them. So with that, thanks for watching this video, guys. I hope you learned something, and just be sure to stay safe. With that, thanks for watching this video, guys. Be sure to check out all of our other ones. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat. All how farms work. And with that, I'll see you next time.